as a typical American before 9/11, I was like, you know what, just set it out. You could all just fall into the middle of the sea and it doesn't matter to me because you're always fighting. Now 9/11 happened. I thought, gee, maybe I should pay attention to this. And many Americans did and saw, wait a minute, there's trouble.
Well, I was getting this question in the 1990s, and I said that the West really doesn't understand militant Islam. So I wrote a book in 1995, and I said that if the West doesn't wake up to the suicidal nature of militant Islam, the next thing you'll see is the militant Islam is bringing down the World Trade Center.
That's the price that we all pay. The value destiny comes to nothing. I can't tell you where we're going. I guess there's just no way of knowing.
As you just heard, Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu wrote a book in 1995 where he predicted that militant Islam would bring down the World Trade Center. His book is titled Fighting Terrorism: How Democracies Can Defeat Domestic and International Terrorism. Now here's a New York Times op-ed written by Russian President Vladimir Putin in 1999 titled Why We Must Act. Quote, when President Clinton and I met in Oslo earlier this month, we discussed the situation in Chechnya. Accounts of that conversation in the American media, understandably, emphasized the president's warnings about the impact of Russia's military operations. Because we value our relations with the United States and care about Americans' perception of us, I want to explain our actions in clear terms. To do so, I ask you to put aside for a moment the dramatic news reports from the Caucasus and imagine something more placid. Ordinary New Yorkers or Washingtonians asleep in their homes. Then, in a flash, hundreds perish in explosions at the Watergate or at an apartment complex on Manhattan's West Side. Thousands are injured, some horribly disfigured. Panic engulfs a neighborhood, then a nation. Russians do not have to imagine such a calamity. More than 300 of our citizens in Moscow and elsewhere suffered that fate earlier this year when bombs detonated by terrorists demolished 5 apartment blocks. Russians do not need to view the latest James Bond movie to see that macabre story unfold. Rather, we saw it in all too real life as guerrillas based in Chechnya mounted bloody raids on neighboring Dagestan. They forcibly occupied several communities, terrorizing the inhabitants. The stated goal was to establish an Islamic Republic, an idea thoroughly alien to the vast majority of local citizens. To Americans, these scenarios must seem rather far-fetched. The notion of armed guerrillas roaming through the countryside intimidating citizens is something to be found in bad movies or second-rate novels. Yet in the southern corner of my country, they are as real as the freshly turned cemetery plots that have chronicled the violence over the last several years. No government can stand idly by when terrorism strikes. It is a solemn duty of all governments to protect their citizens from danger. Americans obviously understand this concept. When 2 United States embassies in Africa were blown up, American warplanes were soon dispatched to bomb suspected terrorist facilities in Sudan and Afghanistan. Americans also have had first-hand experience with religious fanaticism financed from overseas sources. The World Trade Center bombing in New York City was the sad result of such extremism. Terrorism today knows no boundaries. Its purveyors collaborated with each other over vast distances. We know that a great deal of the violence emanating from Chechnya is financed from abroad. The same terrorists who are associated with the bombing of America's embassies have a foothold in the Caucasus. We know that Shamil Basiev, the so-called Chechen warlord, gets assistance on the ground from an itinerant guerrilla leader with a dossier similar to that of Osama bin Laden. And one of your television networks recently reported that according to United States intelligence sources, bin Laden himself is helping to finance the guerrillas. Putin asked you to imagine if terrorists linked to Osama bin Laden attacked New York, blew up buildings, and injured thousands of people. Roughly 2 years after Putin wrote this, that exact event happened. And the US government did exactly what Putin wanted them to do. Ask yourself, is Putin psychic? Don't forget, Bibi also predicted this in 1995.
Carl, I want to take you back to your report last night on those 60 people who are Israelis who were detained in the anti-terror investigation, and the suspicion that some investigators have that they may have picked up information on the 9/11 attacks ahead of time, not passed it on. There was a report, you'll recall, that the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, did indeed send representatives to the U.S. to warn just before 9/11 that a major terrorist attack was imminent. Why does that leave room for the lack of a warning?
Well, I remember the report, Brett. We did it first internationally right here on your show on the 14th. What investigators are saying is that that warning from the Mossad was non-specific and general.
Mossad, the Israeli intelligence, warned the U.S. just before 9/11 that a major terrorist attack was imminent. However, that warning was non-specific and general. Putin had telephoned President Bush 2 days before the attacks to warn that Russian intelligence has detected signs of an incipient terrorist campaign, something long in preparation coming out of Afghanistan. So Israeli and Russian intelligence both warned the US just before 9/11 that a major terrorist attack was imminent, and Putin began pinning the blame on Afghanistan. Bush then saw Putin as someone he could trust, and this improved the relationship between the US and Russia. Russia provided intelligence on terrorists, and Putin coordinated with Central Asian nations to allow US forces for the first time to use military bases of the former Soviet Union for the war in Afghanistan. Putin said in a televised address, "Russia knows directly what terrorism means, and because of this, we more than anyone understand the feelings of the American people. In the name of Russia, I want to say to the American people, we are with you." Months later, he revealed he had a premonition about terrorists and September 11. Quote, "I told my American colleague, this really worries me. I have the feeling something is going to happen, that they are apparently preparing something."
Joining me now here in the BBC World studio is the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who's in London at the moment. Mr. Barak, welcome to BBC World. First, your reaction, having heard what's happened. At least 4 planes have been hijacked, and there may be more.
The world will not be the same from today on. I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. Bin Laden sits in Afghanistan. There is a source of terror.
Identify there. Because we're not saying he's responsible for this necessarily.
No, we don't say that he's responsible.
On 9/11, just 1 hour after the North Tower collapsed, Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak was on BBC basically pinning the blame on bin Laden and Afghanistan. Remember, Putin began sowing these seeds 2 years prior and also blamed bin Laden and Afghanistan 2 days before 9/11. A lot of people in alternative media will criticize the US for not having sufficient evidence to blame bin Laden, but then they're completely silent on Putin, who said that Russia needs no proof of the guilt of bin Laden. Putin criticized Saudi Arabia for refusing to let the US launch attacks against Afghanistan from bases on its territory. Quote, "It's not a question of soldiers preparing strikes against Muslims, but rather of soldiers preparing strikes against terrorists." One of the main focuses after 9/11 was the invasion of Afghanistan. If Saudi Arabia was truly a main culprit in 9/11, as the gatekeepers claimed, why the hell would Saudi Arabia not aid the bombing of Afghanistan? King Salman told former US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Robert Jordan, that 9/11 was an Israeli plot. I'm not denying that Saudi citizens were involved, but at the architectural level, it's Israeli and Russian intelligence.
This is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror.
Thanks to Papist Kreuper for this important article titled, "Wary Putin Sounded Bin Laden Alarm Years Ago." This was written by Israeli journalist Yuri Dan after he interviewed Meir Dagan, the former director of Mossad. Quote, "In 1999, Putin, then chief of Russia's foreign intelligence, asked Israel's intelligence for cooperation in tracking down Muslim extremists in Russia. Major General Meir Dagan told me." Dagan, who had served as anti-terror expert to Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, recalled how Putin told him Osama bin Laden is assisting the Chechen terrorists. That was when a basis for Israeli-Russian cooperation in fighting terrorism was laid. Bibi and Putin both predicted 9/11 years in advance. Israeli and Russian intelligence both warned the US about a major terrorist attack just before 9/11. Israel and Russia both blamed bin Laden without evidence. And now we know Israeli and Russian intelligence were working together during 9/11. If you believe that Israel was behind 9/11, then you have to take into consideration that Russia assisted them. The week before 9/11, Russian warplanes were deliberately harassing US aircrafts over the Pacific. This wasn't an accident. As a result of Russia's provocation, NORAD announced on September 9th, 2001 that they would deploy fighter aircrafts to monitor Russia's Air Force exercise in the Russian Arctic and North Pacific Ocean. NORAD allocated forces were to remain in place until the end of the Russian exercise. On 9/11, NORAD's radars were spread around the periphery of the US, looking outward for potential invaders. Inside US borders, very few radars were feeding neat scopes. In essence, technicians were half blind, trying to separate hijacked airliners from thousands of skin paint returns. At the time, more than 4,000 aircraft were airborne over the nation, most in the northeast sector, which monitors 500,000 square miles of airspace. Do you honestly believe Russia pulling this stunt a week before 9/11 is just a coincidence? They were helping Israel ensure 9/11 turned out the way it did. Why? Because Putin wanted bin Laden to take the fall. In 1999, he wrote, "The same terrorists who are associated with the bombing of America's embassies have a foothold in the Caucasus. Bin Laden himself is helping to finance the guerrillas. Bin Laden supported the Chechens, who Putin wanted to paint as terrorists. Once Bin Laden became public enemy number one, Putin was able to portray the Chechens as the aggressor in the conflict. He won over America and avoided sanctions from the international community at a time when Russia needed to rebuild. For example, in 1999, when Bush was just a presidential candidate, he said that he would suspend foreign aid to Russia if they didn't change their Chechnya policy. He also said, "I think Russia has stepped over the bounds. I think the idea of bombing innocent Russian women and children has stepped over the bounds of international norms." Now let's look at what Bush had to say about the Chechens after 9/11. Quote, "The people who seized the hostages were killers, like the people who carried out the attack on America. Some people are attempting to blame Vladimir, but it is the terrorists that ought to be blamed for everything. I'm not condoning any violent responses by the Chechens, but Putin wanted to win over Bush and he got him hook, line, and sinker. After the 9/11 false flag, Bush completely switched his stance on Russia and these two became best buddies." Bush said about Putin, "You only invite a good friend to your home." In response, Putin said that the US was fortunate at such a critical time in its history to have such a man of character at its helm. No, it's not only Putin that was lying to Bush. Bush was an idiot surrounded by neocons and other traitors in the US government. This is not an endorsement of the Brookings Institute, but this title they wrote 2 months after 9/11 is extremely accurate. Bush, Putin, the end of the Cold War. After 9/11, Putin loved when Bush launched the war on terror because the US intelligence community completely took its focus off of communism and switched it on to Islamic terrorism. As a result, Marxists have severely infiltrated American institutions and destroyed the country from within. The United States is on its way to Weimar Germany, while Russia is stronger than ever. That video where they claim Bin Laden confessed is completely fake. That guy doesn't resemble him at all. Anyone who claims that is Bin Laden in the video is either a drug addict or a liar. And Putin had motive to lie. I know some of you are thinking, 9/11 was mostly done by Mossad. I agree with that. But Russia's role is completely overlooked. Putin wanted Bin Laden framed, and he was influential enough to get his wish. Let's be real. If Bibi got to choose who to frame for 9/11, it would be a Palestinian, 100%. If that were to happen, the Palestinians would suffer a worse fate than the Afghanis and the Iraqis combined. Israel's Palestinian problem would be over and the Western world wouldn't bat an eye. Putin false flagged the Chechens in 1999. Even though the FSB got caught in one of the planned apartment bombings, Putin was still able to gain support for the war and it catapulted him as Russia's savior. I'll leave a link to my analysis of it in the comment section. Lastly, pay attention to these next video clips and think about how false flag terrorism has benefited these two masterminds.
When the first explosions took place in Moscow, then in Volgodonsk, the public was in a state of stupefaction and shock. This coincided with the appointment of Putin as prime minister. And I think that then about 90 to 95% of people, just like today in America, supported the action the president was taking to eliminate the Chechen bands. But what's interesting is that even now it hasn't been proved that the Chechens did it.
Nations, democracies don't go to war easily, and they usually debate and argue before they do. Sometimes they have to be bombed into going to war. In fact, that's what happened in World War II. All of Europe had been conquered. You had to, America was actually bombed in Pearl Harbor, and that was a pivotal event that opened the eyes of Americans. And once their eyes were opened, they gathered the power that is available in this great free nation, and the result was preordained. I think in a similar way, the bombing of September 11th opened the eyes of Americans to see the great conflict and the great danger that faces us. And once opened, then the overpowering will of the majority of the people of the United States, of the steamroller, is inexorably moving to decide this battle.
I don't care 'cause I'm not there, and I don't care if I'm here tomorrow again and again. You've taken too much of the things that cost you too much. I used to think that the day would never come, but see the light in the shade of the morning sun. My morning sun is a drug that brings me near to the childhood I lost, replaced by fear. Used to think that the day